Wonderful. So thank you again, everyone. Welcome. And like I said, it's my extreme pleasure, and we are very excited to have Celeste here with us. So from introduction perspective, it's my extreme privilege to introduce you to Celeste Warren. She is the VP of Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence. As the leader of Merck's Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence, she is responsible for working with Merck's global leaders to advance and embed diversity and inclusion throughout the organization to enhance the employee experience and maximize business performance. Ms. Warren joined Merck in 1997 and has held numerous positions of increasing responsibility within its human resource organization. Prior to joining Merck in 1997, Celeste worked for 9 years in human resources at Kraft Food, Inc. and General Foods. She has been honored with many awards, including Black Enterprise's Top Executive in Global Diversity and Inclusion, Savoy Magazine's Most Influential Women in Corporate America, Women's E-News, 21 Leaders for the 21st Century, Diversity Global Magazine's Influential Women in Global Diversity, and of course, Diversity Women's Magazine's Elite 100 list. What an accomplishment, such a great list. So it's truly amazing. She serves on the board of RWJ Barnabas Health Systems and All In Together and Merck's Political Action Committee. She is on the Advisory Council of 110. She is also a member of CNBC's Workforce Council, Executive Council, and World's 50 Inclusion and Diversity Impact Community. Celeste's articles on diversity, equity, and inclusion have been featured in numerous national and global publications, and she has had the opportunity to speak at various events across the world. Celeste has attended the University of Kentucky, where she's earned her BS degree. She received her master's degree from Carnegie Mellon University. She is the wife of John Warren and the mother of 2 beautiful children, Christina Celeste and John Stephen Jr. With that, I give you Celeste Warren.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here at this summit. This is something that I'm very, very happy to be here. The supply chain organization at Merck has been something that is near and dear to my heart. I spent a lot of time there through my career. And then also in my previous career at General Foods and Kraft, also in the manufacturing setting. So let's go to the next slide, Rocky, and move forward. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking to you about global diversity and inclusion, and basically kind of how we're looking at it and how it has evolved and how it's going to continue to evolve and maintain its importance across the business landscape, across the globe. And then very importantly, I'd like to open it up for questions that any of you may have, because I really enjoy the dialogue, the engagement, and the conversation. You can go to the next slide. You can go to the next slide. Okay. We have moved through some very, very challenging times, especially over the last 18 to 24 months. We have seen the pandemic just ravage our globe. Every country impacted in such a way that we thought we would never see in our lifetimes. Who would have thought, waking up January 2020, that in just a few short months, we would be shuttered in place, we would be caring about the health and the well-being of our friends, our families, our colleagues, ourselves. Most of us would be sheltered in our homes, only essential workers being able to go and do their jobs and their work, seeing the economy just plummet the way it did with businesses closing because of the pandemic, and just seeing our colleagues, our friends, our co-workers passing away. The death toll is reaching still just unbelievable metrics. And we saw this over a course of time that was just impacting everyone, not just those of us that were employed but our children, students, and just everyone impacted by this pandemic. We also saw that we saw an increase in violence and hate crimes from the perspective of the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor murders, and the hate crimes among our colleagues in the Asian community, and all of the different things that were happening around the globe with the various different aspects of violence, of political and social upheaval. And then, of course, we saw that the Capitol rising in January, coming into 2021 and thinking that it was going to be a new horizon, a new changes, and et cetera. And we saw the Capitol uprising there, something that we just have not seen in our lifetime. And who would have thought that the Olympics, something that many of us look forward to every 2 years, if you look at both the outdoor and the indoor Olympic, outdoor winter and summer Olympics, or every 4 years if you're just a Summer Olympics enthusiast. But who would have thought that the Olympics would be performed with no one in the stands? It just was such a challenging time all of us worked through, having to, those of us that had to work from home, having to have to lead and manage in a different way, and with our employees. So we have moved through some very, very challenging times. Next slide. But those challenging times have really shown us that D&I is going to continue to be important and have an impact around the globe in all of our organizations and our businesses. There's going to be changes in how we work. There's going to be an impact of leaders and managers. There's going to be responsibility. The responsibility of corporations is expanding, not just the bottom line and the top line. And then the impact of equity and the importance of equity and the work that we are all doing is going to really make an impact on organizations. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's go to the next slide. Let's first address the issues around changes in how we work. You can go to the next slide. We have seen with the pandemic, especially, that we have had to look at how we do work in a very different way. We've seen changes in how and where we work, and with those changes, we're going to need to understand the nuances of hybrid working and the impact that it has on diversity, on equity, and on inclusion. We have seen that during this time, especially over 2020 and 2021, we've seen that the work that people are doing, where we originally thought that it only could be done within the four walls of our respective organizations, we've seen that it can be done in other areas. It can be done from the living room, from the bedroom, from the kitchen, from the home offices, from outside on the deck or outside on the front porch. But it can be done in different spaces. And so we survived over the 2020 year with these nuances in how and where we were working. And so it has, the more astute leaders have said, okay, in those spaces, how can we take what we learned and what that was thrust upon us and learn from that? How can we take those learnings and move forward, and the impact that might have on diversity, on equity, and inclusion? And as many organizations go to a hybrid model of working, some that have essentially the roles that are essentially need to be done within the workplace, production and maintenance, research labs as examples, and other roles that can be done more of in a hybrid setting where it can be done in some places other than the office. We're going to have to really make sure that we understand the roles that we're playing and understand how that is going to impact us. So, for example, moving forward in some organizations, as you embrace this next normal, we have to really make sure that we understand the nuances and the impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to make sure that as we are leading and managing organizations and teams, that we don't fall victim to what they call distance bias or proximity bias, where those individuals that have roles and they opt to perform those roles in the work outside in the home in other settings and not be in the office 24/7, 5 days a week. But that we don't, as managers and leaders, think that, okay, I really value the face time. I really value those people that come in, and not look at the work that is performed objectively and look at the priorities and what is accomplished and how they are done in a collaborative fashion in the spirit of inclusion, and make sure that that's what we look at and look at it objectively and not fall victim to any of the biases that we may possess from the standpoint of who's in the workplace and who's not in the workplace. That's just one example. Another example in our space, when we think about patients and telemedicine, and we know that many of us were not going into the doctor's offices, but we were using virtual medical visits, and we were reaching out to our doctors virtually. Telemedicine has increased tremendously over the course of the past couple of years. It was starting a crescendo anyway, pre-pandemic, but now it has just increased. And so we need to make sure that the gaps in patients, the gaps in what we see from the standpoint of those that have access to the technology and have all of these opportunities, that they don't fall prey and we widen the gap between those that have and those that have not. That's an example in the healthcare industry, but that goes across all industries. We see reaching customers through technology and reaching many different aspects of different customers through all different types of technology. And so we want to make sure that we're not widening that gap, and we're paying attention to the haves and the have-nots when it comes to technology, and when it comes to the work setting, and when it comes to how we're going to be moving into this next normal of hybrid working. We have to make sure that as leaders that we are demonstrating our inclusive behaviors, and that we make sure that we are reaching out to our teams and making sure that we're integrating and working together collaboratively as leaders. You can go to the next slide. The second area impacts the way that we have led in the past. And the leaders and people managers are going to need to learn to lead in a much more dynamic work environment with more engaged and empowered employees. And what I mean by that is the awakening that we have seen with our employees over the course of the last 4 to 5 years has been just phenomenal, with the impact of social media, with the impact of 24-hour news cycles, with the impact of different voices elevating and feeling empowered to be able to speak their truth, and not just outside in their communities, but within the workplace. I'd like to say that our companies are just microcosms of the nation, of the world, and those thoughts and those ideals and those different perspectives that are driven by the communities of which people are identified, they are converging on the workplace. And so the days of we don't talk about these things at work, those days are gone. Those days of not talking about politics or religion I can remember when I was coming into the workplace decades ago, those were those unspoken rules that you just didn't talk about certain things in the workplace. And that is just not the case anymore. With the rise and the increase of the millennial, this generation, that Generation Y and Generation Z that's come into the workplace, they have more open ideals and thoughts and beliefs around various different aspects across the many dimensions of diversity. They're more socially in tune with that identity, and they represent these ideals and these beliefs in the workplace. Over the course of 2020, you saw the protest, and not just in the various different cities impacted by brutality and by xenophobia and by homophobia and gender inequality, but you saw issues that were impacting all different dimensions of diversity across the globe. And those thoughts and beliefs and ideas from those different communities are hitting the workplace. And so leaders need to not just say they have an open door, but they need to make sure that they're practicing that, even in a virtual setting, that they're opening themselves up to dialogue more so than they have in the past. The workforce is much more dynamic. And so they're going to need to be able to really stretch those muscles around how they're leading and how they're engaging their employees and the conversations that they're having around diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's going to become even more and more important that they have D&I capabilities, that they're understanding all of the different cultures. They may not be an expert in all of the different cultures across the globe. We can't expect anyone to be an expert, but you need to be in tune with your employees and meet them where they are and understand their needs, and not just being able to just tell them, here's the task that we need you to be doing, or here's the strategy implementation that we need you to be doing when you come into the workplace. But we need to be able that we're engaging them on a much higher level, understanding the needs of them as in the various different dimensions of diversity that they represent. Because when we do that, we will have a much more engaged workforce. Without an engaged workforce, you stifle innovation, you stifle creativity, you stifle productivity. And this is not a place where people come into the workforce and just shed their identities. All of these things that I talked about earlier in the presentation around the challenges that people across different dimensions of diversity are facing in their respective communities, that doesn't just go away when they come into the workforce. It's not like a car wash, in the analogy that I use, where the car is going through the car wash and it's scrubbed and it's clean, and then on the other end it's a different car. It's cleaned and it's sort of wiped down. Well, people don't do that. They face challenges that they're facing in their communities, in their homes, with their neighbors, however they identify. And they're not going through a car wash and when they walk through the doors of the organization and then shedding all of that identity. That comes with them to the workplace. And now, these days, more than ever, it's coming into the workplace, those different perspectives and ideas. And those thoughts are not just staying around the water cooler or with different groups in the cafeteria tables or on the back stairwells during coffee breaks and different breaks throughout the day. They're hitting the offices, they're hitting the conference rooms, they're hitting the boardrooms. And so we have to be prepared. We have to be prepared to have these conversations as leaders, because if we are not, we will not be able to ensure that we have a productive and engaged and empowered workforce to fulfill the missions of our respective organizations. It becomes extremely critical as leaders and people managers that we build our skills and our capabilities around diversity, around inclusion, around psychological safety, around empowerment, and we're in touch with our own biases and making sure that we're keeping those in check, and it doesn't impact any of the decisions that we have to make as leaders. You can go to the next slide. The third, you went too far. Go back one. There you go. The third aspect is around the responsibility of corporations is expanding. Investors, shareholders, and employees are demanding more from companies in the way of social responsibility and people responsibility. And let me just give you an example. When we think about the war for talent, and we think about the labor market that's out there, we see and we understand that it is very it is evolving. The demographics of the labor force is evolving. And one of the largest growing, as far as generations in the labor market is Generation Y, Generation Z. And their ideals are very, as I said, are very different from perhaps previous generations. And so when they are looking for an organization that they want to join as a candidate, they're looking for organizations that have the same beliefs and ideals that they do. And they want to know what those beliefs and ideals are. And so, I can remember having conversations with interviews with different candidates, and they ask the questions around the company's stance on various different issues, and where are they from the standpoint of ESG and diversity and inclusion and all of those different areas. And so they want to make sure that they are going to an organization that, yes, that they have a very strong mission, that they're sound financially, that they're sound from the standpoint of their culture, but they also want to know about the culture, the people, the responsibility that the corporate responsibility stands, and the ideals and the values and standards of that company. And so when we think about the war for talent and we think about trying to get the best and the brightest into our respective organizations, we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that, because our candidates are paying attention to it as well. Investors and shareholders are becoming more keen to the cultures of the organization, because they know that if you don't have a strong culture, if you don't have a culture of inclusion, if you don't have a diverse workforce, then you are basically stifling the productivity of the organization. And so I get called on many investor calls where the investors are asking about the company culture. They're asking about our goals and our responsibilities around diversity, around equity, and around inclusion. And it becomes more and more important that we are able to answer these questions in a way that is showing the accountability of leaders, that's showing the responsibility of our people managers, and it's showing the encouragement and the empowerment of our people within the organization. And so it becomes really, really important that companies, pay attention to the bottom line, the top line, et cetera. But you also need to be making sure that you're paying attention to the culture of the organization, to make sure that you have a pulse on that people understand that we are paying attention to it all the way through the organization. We're talking about it in our boardroom with our directors. We're talking about it in our C-suite meetings with all of our executives. We're talking about it at our management team meetings. We're talking about it within our employee bases, and making sure that it's ingrained in everything that you do, and talking about the responsibility around diversity, around equity, around inclusion, and ensuring that we have a diverse and inclusive work environment for all of our employees. That becomes extremely, extremely important. You can go to the next slide. The work that we're doing now around equity is causing some disruption. And so let me talk a little bit about that, what I mean by that. People sometimes confuse equity and equality. And let me just illustrate what I'm talking about. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the cartoon illustration of the three individuals looking over the fence. And the first illustration in that cartoon shows them, they're all standing on one rock. And you have someone who is taller and is able to see over the fence with the rock. You have the person standing in the middle on the rock that is just able to see over the fence. And then you have the person who, even with the one rock, the third person, they're not able to see over the fence. And so you go to that second picture, and it shows where we've given that third person, instead of just one rock, we've given them 3 rocks. And then the second person, we have given them 2 rocks. And then the first person, they continue to be standing on one rock. And now everybody can see over the fence, but they have different rocks. That's equity. And so what we see now is, when I talk about that disruption, that first person who was standing on one rock in picture 1, and he's still standing on one rock on picture 2, is looking to his right and saying, well, how come that person has 2 rocks and how come that other person has 3 rocks? I don't understand. That's not fair. And what they're not seeing is that these individuals, person number 2 and person number 3, needed those additional rocks so they could see over the fence. And that fence in this analogy represents all of the isms, the systemic isms that exist, whether that be sexism, homophobia, racism, different isms against people with disabilities, different phobias that exist, and the challenges that they face that are systemic, that the person who was standing on the one rock, that because of the privilege that they've been a part of, they have never really noticed the fence because they've always been able to see over it. And so, unfortunately, we have to make sure that they understand that the fence is there. And so these acts of equity, of putting those rocks underneath the third person and the second person so they can freely see over the fence, something that first person has always been able to do. We have to put those rocks there. Those are the actions of equity. But at the same time, and some of you may have seen this illustration, the third picture shows the fence torn down. And so everyone can see over the fence without any rocks. And so that's the equality. That's where we're trying to get to. We have to, at the same time, put those rocks in place at the same time that we are tearing down that fence and trying to fight the systemic issues that exist throughout the globe and within our organizations. And so as we're doing that work, it's causing a little bit of disruption for some. As I said, that person that has always been standing on the one rock is asking the questions around, well, why do we have that program for women? And why do we have that program for African Americans or Latinos and Hispanics? And why is it that I can't get in here? And why is it I view it as a zero-sum game? And they need to understand, we need to help them to understand, first of all, the fence and the different systemic issues that have been in place for centuries in some cases, and then help them to understand and educate and make aware. And then they can understand some of the programs that we have to put in place also while trying to disrupt that fence and tear it down. And so we have to maintain the courage of our convictions during this time. We have to make sure that we're having those bold and courageous and inclusive conversations with those individuals so they can understand the dilemma that we're in, the world that we're in, and then, help us to be able to create that future that we want to see that is truly equality, that the fence is torn down, that we don't need rocks, that everyone, however they identify, is able to be productive, they're able to be successful, and it's not an unlimited supply of resources. Equality doesn't mean that equal rights and equality doesn't mean that you're taking away rights from others. It just means that we're trying to make sure that everyone is on the same playing field, that everyone has the same opportunities to be able to achieve and rise to their potential, whatever those aspirations may be. And when we do that, we will have a much more productive and successful organization. And so we have to make sure that we're maintaining our courage of our convictions during this time that we're in right now of doing this work. And so where you are asking getting those questions in town halls and staff meetings and one-on-one conversations, make sure that you are meeting people where they are and having those conversations, as long as they are aligned with the standards and the values of your organization around integrity, ethics, diversity, and inclusion. And so sometimes, we may not be able to meet everyone at their needs, depending on what those needs are and the gregariousness of the behavior. But as long as it is aligned with the values and standards of your corporation around integrity, ethics, and diversity and inclusion, we will be able to weather the storm. We will be able to withstand the convergence of different ideas around diversity and inclusion, we will be able to move the organization forward. If we have patience, if we have solidarity and collaboration to be able to have those conversations. I guarantee you, having those hard conversations will get us to an inclusive organization, which is what we want to get to. Next slide. And we have to continue to press on through the various different challenges that we're going to see. We're going to need to advance diversity and inclusion and equity as a priority as organizations evolve. The only thing that is that we can count on that is the same is change. We know that organizations will always evolve. They have to evolve or they die. And so as organizations evolve, as priorities change and evolve, we have to make sure that diversity and inclusion stays front and center. We have to sustain this momentum for change. Last year, in that May timeframe, June timeframe, we heard a lot of statements of solidarity coming after the George Floyd murder, a lot of corporations issuing statements of solidarity. And so we need to make sure that that's not just a moment in time, that the statements around the solidarity with the Pan-Asian community, around xenophobia, the statements around supporting those of different religious faiths, that solidarity across all the dimensions of diversity, that solidarity, it continues. And it wasn't just a moment in time, but they are momentum it's like a crescendo. If you use a music analogy, that crescendo keeps going and going. And that's the way we have to think about diversity and inclusion. We have to continue to drive organizational capabilities as well. We have to continue to drive D&I as a fundamental, foundational organizational capability that is going to be that is going to enable the culture to thrive. And then, as I said earlier, we have to manage the convergence of those different ideas and beliefs in the workplace and make sure that we're able to do that. It is not going to be easy. It's not an easy journey, but we have to make sure that we're able to do that. Next slide. This is what we call a diversity and inclusion maturity matrix for those of us in the diversity and equity industry. And you use it to basically measure the maturity of the organization when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And you can go all the way from basic to sustainable within the organization to transformative. And we should all aspire to be, to have organizations that are transformative, where global diversity and inclusion it's global in nature, it's transforming the environment, the culture, and the business landscape. And it's also something that we want to see, to be a role model, that it's something that is going to continue to, excuse me, that it's something that's going to continue to keep us successful. You can go to the next slide. And with that, I just like to say thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you for having the opportunity to speak with all of you, and I'll entertain your questions.
Amazing talk. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you now.
Okay, I just wanted to say thank you so much. That was amazing, wonderful, wonderful talk and a keynote here, because there are so many things that you said that resonates with us. And there are a few things that I've been monitoring the chat as well. People love the car wash analogy, right? So that was pretty powerful. And as well as your commentary about maintaining the solidarity, right? So we have to be there together for each other, right? I mean, that's what allyship is. And that's, at least we can do our part to keep this moving and make sure that we are creating an environment and leaving an environment that is positive, that is impactful, and that creates an inclusive feeling for everyone. Like you said, it's not about taking away rights from others, but it's about equal opportunities. Very well said. So thank you so much for all those key insights and great insights. We do have some questions here, if I can quickly go to them. I'll take some from the audience, and there are some that we selected ahead of time as well from other folks who submitted the questions for your session. So right now we have one from Anu Hans, and it says, what is the role that allyship can play in progressing D&I?
Oh, absolutely. Great question. Allyship is critical to being able to progress D&I. And I like to use the model from a colleague, Kenji Yoshino, who is a professor of law at the New York University. And his model talks about allyship for all. And so we want to make sure that we're not just being an ally for one, we're not just being an ally for some, but we're being an ally for all. We're being an ally for all of those who identify differently than what we do. And so, and the reason why I like that particular demonstration of an articulation of allyship is because it's not enough that we rely on those that happen to be in the majority, but we can rely on each other to help each other from the standpoint of allyship. Allyship is so critical. And I love the theme for the Discover Summit around the role of allyship in the evolving workplace. All of us have a role to play when it comes to creating the diverse and inclusive environment that we want to see in our respective organizations. And so if you're wondering, well, what can I do? I don't know what I can do. I feel like it's overwhelming. I feel like I don't know, the role that I can play. Everybody can play a role. And one of the roles that you can play is by being an ally. And start small. Start by going and just Googling diversity and inclusion, or Googling equity, or Googling about a certain community that you want to learn more about, whether that be the Pan-Asian community or the LGBTQ community, or the persons with disabilities, or whatever it might be. But you want to learn about a different culture, and Google it and learn and read and read books or read articles, and then sit down with a colleague, sit down with someone who you know that's maybe from that community. And have lunch with them, invite them out to lunch, invite them out to coffee or during a break, and just have a conversation and a dialogue in a safe space to ask questions and talk about what you learned, and just have a conversation and a dialogue. And again, then begin to open up your sphere and what I call widen the screen, and talk with more individuals. And if you're a people manager, invite, set a time aside at your staff meetings to engage your leadership team, your management team, on conversations around diversity and equity and inclusion, whether that be practice sharing, or talking about challenges that you have in the workplace, or just encounters, but learning from each other. But you can do lots of different things as an ally. And we will not be able to move the organization forward when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion unless we have more active allies. People are being allies to those that identify to them, allies to all, and helping and being a little bit of those disruptors as well. Great question.
No, very well said. Thank you so much. Like you said, we all have to be there for each other and take time and actually take actions. And they don't have to be huge actions. We can start small. It's all about the intent and about taking that first step, right? So
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have time for maybe another question. And this is, we don't have a name. It's from anonymous attendee, but nonetheless, what do you believe the greatest barrier is to inclusion in big companies? Any thoughts on how to overcome? Which is, I think, all of us are curious to know if we can share something.
Oh, wow. I think in the journey that we are on and continue on, I guess, no company's at utopia. But I think sometimes the biggest barriers are just getting started. Sometimes organizations, people in the organizations or leaders, they feel overwhelmed. They feel that well, where do I get started? How do I start a D&I strategy? How do I think about it? And they get hung up on all, just the overwhelming task of it all. And so, I think don't start thinking about it so overwhelmingly. Start in bite-sized chunks. Think about, your management team. Think about the organization. You can take pulse surveys. You can do different things. But I think sometimes getting started is just an obstacle. And then also, I think a second obstacle would be what we hear a lot is, and we hear it across multitudes of organizations, where I call it sort of the hourglass syndrome. You have senior leaders that have embraced the messages. They're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in town halls and employee organizational meetings where they're addressing the whole organization. And then you have employees who want to be a part of a very diverse and inclusive work environment. They want that psychological safety. They want that, and they hear the messages from the senior leaders, and they're excited and engaged. And then something happens when it gets to the middle layer of the management teams, where the message from the top and the feedback from the bottom, it's sort of just getting caught in the middle, in that hourglass, that the middle of the hourglass, and the management, first and second line managers. And so, and those are for a variety of different reasons. That, over the course of the last years, as organizations have flattened their organizations and more has fallen on the responsibilities and the roles of first and second line managers as support functions, HR, finance, IT, and many of the support functions have dwindled in size, and it's been more direct service for management teams, and them being able to have to go online and get answers and all of this, and not having a lot of people to talk to. So there's a lot on people managers, but sometimes the message of diversity and inclusion, it falls short, and it doesn't get through, and it doesn't get up as well. And so that tends to be a challenge. And so we just have to make sure that we're providing people managers with the resources, number one, so they can be successful. And then secondly, the senior leaders, don't just embrace diversity and inclusion and say the messaging and talk about your vision. Yes, you must do all of those different things, but you have to be very specific around the expectations that you have of your first and second line managers. And if I go to your first and second line managers and I say, hey, what does your manager expect of you when it comes from diversity and inclusion? Can they answer that question succinctly, clearly, concisely? And they know how to operationalize the vision that you have as a leader to drive it through the organization with their teams. And so that is something that we have to make sure that the leaders, they're not just all patting each other on the back and congratulating each other around their vision and the support and how they've embraced diversity and inclusion, but they're making sure through their management spine that they all of their managements are embracing diversity, equity, inclusion, and operationalizing that vision with the people that they manage.
Wow. Okay. Very nice. Very well said. Thank you so much. We are at 12, but if you have a few more minutes, there's one more question that if we can get to it. Yeah. So this is from Maria Hill. Thank you, Celeste, for a very powerful keynote. What is the usual timeline for organizations to grow through D&I matrix process?
Yeah, so, they say that to change culture, because that's what, we're essentially thinking about, when I think about the way I think about it, and, I have to go to my think about my upbringing in manufacturing and supply chain and my engineer colleagues. Change management is a process. And when I think about diversity and inclusion, what we're talking about is change management. And we're talking about mobilizing the organization to impact change, to create that diverse and inclusive environment that we all want to see. And so we need to make sure that we're doing it. And most of the experts, the researchers say that if you're talking about changing a culture, you're talking about from the beginning to getting to starting to see impact, you're talking probably, anywhere from 4 to 5, 6 years. But that doesn't mean that you won't see, there's not things that you can tackle when you start your strategy and implementing it, the low-hanging fruit. Every organization has low-hanging fruit, and you go after that and identify those key milestones. But to see like big rocks moving, big mountains moving, it usually takes around, anywhere from 4, 5, 6 years to see the big improvements. But you go after that, you're going to start to see some change immediately. You're going to see even more change, after year 1, after year 2, etc. It's not like everything is going to be this big bang and you won't see any change until 4 or 5 years. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that it's a gradual thing. And where you see the biggest mountains moving within the organization, usually around culture change, it's usually around that 5-year mark.
Okay. Very good. Thank you so much. This was amazing. Very eye-opener. We got some really good insights and some ideas that I'm sure definitely all the organizations and the leaders and people managers here will take away from this discussion and actually be able to utilize those tips and tricks to improve the DNA, the diversity fabric of their organization, right? So I'm very thankful for your time. And so is everyone who is here today attending with us. And as you can see in the chat, there are lots of messages pouring in. People are very thankful for everything that you have shared with us and for your time. So Celeste, we are very glad that you were able to join us. So thank you very much. And I think that will conclude our session with you today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I just enjoyed it. So words of wisdom, just make sure that you stay progressing, stay in the battlefield, keep progressing diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout your respective organizations, your departments, your management teams. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. So with that, that was Celeste Warren. A big round of applause for her. We learned so much from her today. Now the next on the agenda is a lunch break. So we will connect again for our panel that will be given by Anita Ricketts about intentional allyship in the workplace. So after lunch, please go back to the auditorium or come back to the auditorium and click on the link for the session and join us at that time. So we'll see you after lunch. Thank you so much for being with us today so far. See you again soon.